April 19, 1775. Before the sun even thought about rising over Massachusetts, a single spark was about to ignite a revolution that would change the world forever. This wasn't just another skirmish. This was the day ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers stood up to the most powerful army on earth. This is the story of Lexington and Concord, the shot heard round the world. To really get what happened on that fateful day, we need to rewind a bit. The 1770s were a pressure cooker in the American colonies. Imagine being told you have to pay extra taxes on everything from tea to paper, all decided by a government thousands of miles across the ocean. A government where you have no voice. The colonists called it taxation without representation, and it felt deeply unfair. Tensions were boiling over, especially in Boston, a hotbed of revolutionary spirit. The Boston Tea Party had already sent a defiant message, and in response, the British clamped down hard, imposing what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They even sent thousands of soldiers, the famous Redcoats, to occupy the city and enforce order. It felt less like being protected and more like being under military rule. The colonists weren't just sitting around complaining. They were organizing. They formed militias, groups of citizen soldiers ready to defend their towns at a moment's notice. That's where the name Minutemen comes from. They had to be ready in a minute. They began secretly stockpiling weapons, gunpowder, and cannons. One of their biggest arsenals was hidden away in the quiet, rural town of Concord, about 20 miles west of Boston. The British commander, General Thomas Gage, knew about this. He couldn't let a rebel army arm itself right under his nose. So he hatched a plan, a secret nighttime raid to march to Concord, seize the weapons, and maybe even arrest a couple of key rebel leaders along the way, Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were believed to be hiding in Lexington. On the night of April 18th, the plan was set in motion. Around 700 elite British troops began to move out of Boston under the cover of darkness. But the colonists had spies everywhere. Dr. Joseph Warren, a key leader in Boston, got wind of the plan. He knew he had to warn Lexington and Concord. He summoned two riders, a silversmith named Paul Revere and a tanner named William Dawes. You've probably heard of Paul Revere's midnight ride, but he wasn't alone. They took different routes to make sure the message got through. As Revere galloped through the countryside, he didn't shout, "The British are coming," as the legend says. Remember, at this point, many colonists still considered themselves British subjects. He whispered urgently at each door, "The regulars are coming out." Everyone knew who the regulars were. The warning system, a network of alarm bells, bonfires, and gunshots, sprang to life, spreading the news from town to town. The countryside was waking up. As dawn broke on April 19th, the advance guard of the British force, about 240 men, marched into Lexington. They were met by a small, tense group of about 80 local militiamen gathered on the town green. Their captain, John Parker, a veteran of previous wars, knew they were hopelessly outnumbered. He wasn't looking for a fight. He reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." A British officer rode forward and yelled at the colonists to lay down their arms and disperse. For a moment, there was just confusion. The militiamen started to back away, but they weren't dropping their guns. Suddenly, a shot rang out. To this day, no one knows for sure who fired it. Was it a nervous colonist? A jumpy redcoat? It doesn't matter. That single shot shattered the morning quiet and all hope of a peaceful resolution. The British soldiers, without orders, unleashed a devastating volley of musket fire. The Minutemen, caught completely off guard, scrambled. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead on the green, with 10 more wounded. The British had suffered only one minor injury. It was a massacre, not a battle. The Redcoats reformed their lines and continued their march toward their main objective, Concord. But the alarm had been raised. The news of the bloodshed in Lexington spread like wildfire, enraging colonists across the region. When the main British force arrived in Concord, a few hours later, they found the town mostly empty. The rebels had received the warning and had already moved most of the weapons and gunpowder to new hiding spots. The soldiers split up to search the town. They found a few cannon, which they disabled, and burned some wooden gun carriages. But from a hill overlooking the town, hundreds of militiamen from Concord and surrounding towns watched as smoke began to rise. They feared the British were burning their homes. Their commander, Colonel James Barrett, made a decision. He turned to his men and said, "Will you let them burn the town down?" They resolved to march down to the North Bridge, which was being held by a small contingent of British soldiers, and confront them. This time, it was different. As the 400 or so militiamen advanced toward the bridge, the British soldiers fired a warning volley, but the colonists kept coming. They were organized now, marching in formation. When the British fired again, this time hitting several of the Minutemen, the colonial officer in command, Major John Buttrick, yelled, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" The colonists unleashed a coordinated, disciplined volley of their own. The redcoats, stung by the organized resistance from what they thought were just simple farmers, broke ranks and retreated in panic back toward the main force in town. The shot heard round the world had been answered. The colonists had proven they could and would fight back. The British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, realized his mission was a failure. The weapons were gone, and now the entire countryside was armed and furious. His only option was to get his men back to the safety of Boston, a grueling 20-mile retreat. But the road back became a nightmare. It was a running battle the entire way. Thousands of militiamen, now swarming in from all over the region, used the landscape to their advantage. They hid behind stone walls, trees, and buildings, firing at the long exposed column of bright red coats. This wasn't the open field warfare the British were trained for. It was chaotic, brutal, and terrifying. The redcoats were exhausted, hungry, and taking casualties at every turn. They were on the verge of complete collapse. Just when it seemed like the British column would be annihilated, they were saved. A relief force of 1,000 fresh troops and artillery, sent out from Boston by General Gage, met them just outside Lexington. This gave the battered soldiers a much-needed rest and some protection. But even with reinforcements, the journey back to Boston was still a harrowing fight. The colonists continued their relentless attacks all the way to the city limits. By the time the British soldiers finally stumbled back into Boston that evening, they had suffered nearly 300 casualties killed, wounded, or missing. The colonists had lost fewer than 100. The battles of Lexington and Concord were a stunning strategic failure for the British, but they were a monumental psychological victory for the colonists. They had stood up to the mighty British Army and not only fought them, but had driven them back. The news electrified the 13 colonies. The point of no return had been crossed. There was no more talking, no more petitions. The war for American independence had begun. In the days that followed, thousands upon thousands of militia from all over New England marched to Boston and surrounded the city, trapping the British Army inside. The siege of Boston had started. What began with a few defiant farmers on a village green had escalated into a full-blown revolution. The shot heard round the world was the starting gun for the race to create a new nation. Thank you so much for watching. The story of Lexington and Concord is a powerful reminder that sometimes the course of history can be changed by ordinary people willing to stand up for what they believe in. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more stories from history. We'll see you in the next one.